A beautiful young woman, just 43 years old, stands trembling in a blood-soaked courtyard as a frenzied mob of over 200 killers surrounds her. Her blonde hair catches the September sunlight for the last time as someone whispers in her ear, "Just say you hate the Queen, and you can live." She looks into the eyes of her executioners and speaks the words that will seal her fate. "I would rather die." What happens next is so unspeakably brutal that eyewitnesses vomited on the spot. And the stories were so horrific they were banned from being spoken aloud in polite society for over a century. This isn't just another execution from history. This is the story of Princess Marie Thérèse Louise de Savoy, Carignan, Princess de Lamballe, whose loyalty to Marie Antoinette cost her everything, including her life in the most savage way imaginable. But what they did to her corpse afterward was so twisted, so psychologically depraved, that it broke the mind of a queen and traumatized an entire city. I'm about to reveal not just how she died, but the stomach-churning details of what the mob did to her dismembered body that historians have tried to bury for 230 years. Fair warning, what you're about to hear will change how you view human nature forever. Because this wasn't just murder. This was ritualistic savagery that turned a human being into a weapon of psychological torture. And here's the most terrifying part. Every single detail I'm about to tell you actually happened. No exaggeration. No Hollywood drama. Just pure, documented historical horror that proves human beings are capable of cruelties that would make the devil himself recoil in disgust. The date was September 3rd, 1792. The place was La Force prison in Paris, and the air itself seemed to reek of death and decay. For 2 straight days, the sounds of screaming, hacking, and dying had echoed through the stone corridors as revolutionary mobs systematically butchered over 600 prisoners. The cobblestones of Paris were literally stained red with blood that had flowed like rivers through the streets. Princess de Lamballe had been listening to the massacre from her cell. The wet sounds of blades cutting through flesh, the final gasps of the dying, the cheers of the killers as they celebrated each death. She knew her turn was coming. She could hear them getting closer, cell by cell, dragging out prisoners and returning minutes later, their clothes splattered with fresh blood and chunks of human tissue. But let me take you back to understand how this angel of loyalty became public enemy number 1. Marked for the most brutal death imaginable. Marie Thérèse was born into Italian nobility in 1749, and by age 17, she had married the incredibly wealthy Prince de Lamballe. But fate had cruel plans. Her husband died within a year, leaving her an 18-year-old widow with an enormous fortune and no purpose in life. That's when she entered the glittering, deadly world of Versailles and met another young foreign woman who would change her destiny forever, Marie Antoinette. Their friendship was instantaneous and absolute. In a court filled with spies, backstabbers, and political schemers, these 2 women found genuine love and loyalty in each other. When Marie Antoinette became Queen of France, she immediately appointed Lamballe as superintendent of her household, one of the most powerful positions in the kingdom. But this loyalty came with a death sentence attached. As the French people began to starve and revolt, their hatred for the Austrian queen grew into a murderous rage, and anyone close to Marie Antoinette became a target. Revolutionary pamphlets portrayed Lamballe as the queen's lesbian lover, a foreign spy, and a blood-sucking parasite feeding off French suffering. They called her the Austrian whore's Italian bitch, and published graphic illustrations showing her engaging in orgies with the royal family. The propaganda worked. Princess de Lamballe went from being an unknown widow to becoming one of the most hated women in France. Mobs gathered outside her residence chanting for her death. Revolutionary leaders put a bounty on her head. She had become a symbol of everything the people wanted to destroy. When the revolution erupted in 1789, aristocrats fled France in terror, racing for the borders before the guillotine could claim them. Lamballe escaped to safety in London, where her friends and family begged her to stay hidden until the madness passed. She had money, protection, and a comfortable exile waiting for her. But then came the letter that sealed her doom. Marie Antoinette, trapped in the crumbling palace of Versailles, with enemies closing in from all sides, wrote to her dearest friend with a plea that would echo through history. "Come back to me. I must live and die with my friends beside me." The letter was smuggled out of France at enormous risk, carried by loyal servants who knew they faced execution if caught. When Princess de Lamballe read those words, her fate was sealed. Despite knowing she was walking into certain death, despite her family's desperate pleas, despite having every reason to stay safely in exile, she made the decision that would define her forever. She wrote her will, settled her affairs, and boarded a ship back to revolutionary France. She literally wrote her own death warrant out of love. The journey back to Paris in 1791 was a nightmare. She had to travel in disguise, hiding her identity from revolutionary agents who would have killed her on sight. When she finally reached the capital, the city had transformed into something from a horror story. Heads on pikes lined the streets. Bodies swung from lampposts. The gutters ran red with blood as the revolution devoured its enemies. But Lamballe went straight to her queen's side and never left again. She was there during the failed escape attempt to Varennes, when the royal family was dragged back to Paris like common criminals. She was there on June 20th, 1792, when a mob of 20 Zalozan revolutionaries stormed the palace, screaming for the queen's blood while waving severed heads on sticks. Eyewitnesses reported that throughout the entire attack, Lamballe showed no concern for her own safety. She only cared about protecting Marie Antoinette. That superhuman loyalty was about to be rewarded with the most inhuman death imaginable. On August 10th, 1792, the monarchy finally collapsed. The Swiss Guard was massacred defending the palace, their mutilated corpses thrown into mass graves. The royal family was arrested and imprisoned in the temple fortress under 24-hour guard. But Lamballe was separated from her beloved queen and dragged to La Force prison, a hellhole that made medieval dungeons look like luxury hotels. La Force prison was a nightmare of human suffering. Prisoners were crammed into cells designed for half their number, wallowing in their own filth without adequate food, water, or medical care. Disease ran rampant. The walls were covered in the desperate messages of previous inmates who had carved their final words into the stone before being dragged away to execution. And in this house of horrors, Princess de Lamballe waited for death. By late August 1792, Paris had descended into complete madness. Enemy armies were marching on the capital, threatening to burn it to the ground if the royal family was harmed. But instead of frightening the revolutionaries, this threat drove them into a homicidal frenzy. They became convinced that the city's prisons were filled with traitors and spies, just waiting to escape and attack them from within. Revolutionary leader Georges Danton whipped the crowds into a killing frenzy with his infamous speech, "To conquer our enemies, we must dare! Dare again! Always dare!" And France saved. But this daring had transformed into something monstrous, a bloodlust that demanded human sacrifice on an industrial scale. On September 2nd, 1792, the killing began. Mobs armed with axes, pikes, sabers, and clubs swarmed the city's prisons like packs of rabid animals. They set up mock tribunals, nothing more than blood-stained tables where drunken killers would hold 10-second trials before sentencing prisoners to immediate death. The courtyards became slaughterhouses where human beings were hacked to pieces like cattle. For 5 straight days, the September massacres turned Paris into a vision of hell on earth. Over 600 men, women, and even children were butchered in the most savage ways imaginable. Pregnant women were cut open and their unborn babies torn from their wombs. Priests were skinned alive and forced to watch their own flesh being fed to dogs. Elderly aristocrats were beaten to death with their own walking sticks while the crowds cheered and danced in their blood. The killing had become a celebration, a festival of human cruelty that revealed the true depths of revolutionary rage. And through it all, Princess de Lamballe sat in her filthy cell, listening to the screams, and knowing that each day brought her closer to the same fate. She could hear the killers working their way through the prison, cell by cell, dragging out victims and returning minutes later with blood-soaked clothes and pieces of human flesh stuck to their weapons. She wasn't just any prisoner. She was the ultimate prize, Marie Antoinette's best friend, the living symbol of aristocratic corruption, the woman whose death would send the clearest possible message to the Queen about what awaited her. On the morning of September 3rd, they came for her. 2 guards, their clothes still wet with blood from the previous night's killings, unlocked her cell door and told her it was time to face the tribunal. As they led her through the corridors, she passed piles of mutilated corpses, men and women she had known at Versailles, now reduced to unrecognizable chunks of meat scattered across the stone floors. The tribunal was a sick joke. 3 drunk revolutionaries sitting at a table stained with blood and wine, playing God with human lives. They had been judging prisoners for 2 straight days, and in that entire time, not a single person had been declared innocent. Everyone who appeared before them received the same sentence of death. When Princess de Lamballe was dragged before them, she nearly fainted at the sight of the courtyard beyond. The ground was completely carpeted with dismembered bodies, arms, legs, heads, and torsos scattered like pieces of a grotesque puzzle. The smell of death was so overwhelming that several witnesses vomited on the spot. The judges asked her a few routine questions about her identity, which she answered calmly despite the horror surrounding her. Then came the moment that would determine whether she lived or died. They presented her with the oath that could save her life: swear to liberty and equality, and swear hatred to the king and queen and the royal family. This was her last chance. All she had to do was speak a few words denouncing her friend, and she could walk away alive. The man sitting next to her whispered urgently, "Swear it. If you don't swear, you are dead." But Princess de Lamballe looked at her executioners with calm dignity and spoke the words that signed her death warrant. "I will readily swear to liberty and equality, but I cannot swear hatred to the king and queen. It is not in my heart." Another account records her final words differently, but with the same defiant meaning. "Whether I die sooner or later is a matter of indifference to me. I have made the sacrifice of my life." The verdict was immediate. The judge announced with a cruel smile, "Let Madam be set at liberty." It sounded like she was being freed, but everyone in the room knew the truth. "Set at liberty" was code for the mob waiting in the courtyard. It meant this one is yours to kill. 2 guards grabbed her arms and shoved her through the door into the blood-soaked courtyard, straight toward the waiting killers. What happened next was captured by multiple eyewitnesses, and their accounts paint a picture of savagery that defies human comprehension. The moment Princess de Lamballe was pushed into the courtyard, she found herself facing a mob of over 200 killers, their faces twisted with bloodlust and their weapons dripping with fresh gore. For one frozen moment, this elegant woman in her white dress stood alone among the corpses of her fellow prisoners, her blonde hair shining in the September sunlight. Then the first blow fell. A massive pike swung like a club, struck her in the back of the head with such force that her white cap flew off, and her long golden hair tumbled down around her shoulders. Blood immediately began streaming down her face as she staggered but somehow remained standing. The second blow caught her in the forehead, opening a gaping wound that sent more blood cascading over her features. She fell to her knees among the body parts, scattered across the stones, her white dress now rapidly turning crimson. Then the mob swarmed her. What followed was not an execution, it was a feeding frenzy. 200 killers with axes, sabers, pikes, and clubs attacked her simultaneously, each trying to land a blow on the most famous victim of the day. Her screams were drowned out by the roar of the crowd and the wet sounds of blades cutting through flesh and bone. Eyewitnesses reported that the attack was so frenzied that the killers were accidentally wounding each other in their eagerness to participate in her destruction. Blood flew in all directions as Princess de Lamballe was literally torn apart by the mob, her body disappearing beneath a mass of swinging weapons and grasping hands. In less than 5 minutes, Marie Antoinette's dearest friend had been reduced to scattered pieces of meat on the cobblestones of La Force prison. But the killing was just the beginning. What the mob did next transformed murder into psychological warfare of the most depraved kind imaginable. They cut off her head with a rusty saber, sawing through her neck as blood spurted across the courtyard. Then they stripped her mutilated corpse completely naked and began the ritualistic desecration that would haunt Paris for decades to come. Some reports, though disputed by historians, describe horrors too graphic for most people to believe. Revolutionary propaganda claimed that her breasts were cut off and her genitals mutilated, though contemporary records suggest these details were exaggerated for political effect. What we know for certain is that her naked, headless corpse was dragged through the streets of Paris, while the crowd cheered and celebrated. But the true psychological weapon was her severed head. The killers mounted Princess de Lamballe's head on a long pike, her blonde hair hanging down like a bloody curtain, and her lifeless eyes staring blindly ahead. Then they began the most macabre parade in the history of revolutionary France. Hundreds of killers, their clothes soaked in blood, and their faces flushed with murderous excitement, marched through the streets of Paris, carrying their trophy. They sang revolutionary songs, danced around the pike, and stopped at taverns to drink wine, while Princess de Lamballe's head swayed above them like some nightmarish battle standard. But this wasn't random savagery. This was calculated psychological torture with a specific target in mind: Marie Antoinette. The mob's destination was the Temple prison, where the royal family was being held under heavy guard. Their goal was simple but diabolical. They wanted to force the Queen to see what they had done to her dearest friend. They wanted to break her mind with the sight of Princess de Lamballe's severed head. When the blood-drunk mob reached the temple, they gathered beneath the windows and began chanting for Marie Antoinette to come outside. "Come see your friend," they screamed. "Come kiss her goodbye." Some accounts claim they demanded that the Queen kiss the lips of the severed head, though this detail remains disputed. Inside the prison, the royal family could hear the terrifying noise from the courtyard, hundreds of voices screaming for blood, demanding that the Queen witness their gruesome trophy. The king's valet, Monsieur Clairet, made the fatal mistake of looking out the window to see what was happening. What he saw nearly drove him mad with horror. There, mounted on a pike just below the window, was the severed head of Princess de Lamballe, her beautiful face now a mask of congealed blood, and her dead eyes seeming to stare directly at him. Sierra stumbled backward in shock, but it was too late. Marie Antoinette had seen his reaction and demanded to know what was happening outside. The guards tried to block the window and distract her, but the Queen was no fool. She could hear her name being screamed by the mob, could smell the stench of death drifting up from the courtyard. Finally, one of the guards decided that lying would be more cruel than the truth. He looked Marie Antoinette directly in the eyes and spoke the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Madame, they are trying to show you the head of Madame de Lamballe." The reaction was immediate and devastating. Marie Antoinette let out a scream of pure anguish that echoed through the prison corridors, a sound so heartbreaking that it moved even her revolutionary guards to tears. She collapsed in a dead faint, her body hitting the floor like a broken doll. When she finally regained consciousness, the Queen wept uncontrollably for hours. Witnesses reported that she cried all night and for days afterward, her mind shattered by the knowledge of what had happened to the woman who had sacrificed everything out of loyalty and love. But the psychological warfare had worked perfectly. The revolutionaries had found a way to torture Marie Antoinette without even touching her. They had murdered her soul by destroying her dearest friend and forcing her to confront the reality of her own helplessness. That image of Princess de Lamballe's severed head would torment Marie Antoinette until her own execution 10 months later. In her final letters, she wrote about the nightmares that plagued her, the constant vision of her friend's dead face, calling out to her in dreams. But the horror story doesn't end there. What happened to Princess de Lamballe's remains afterward reveals even more about the depths of revolutionary savagery. Her headless, naked corpse was dragged through the streets of Paris for hours while the mob celebrated their victory. According to some accounts, pieces of her body were cut off as souvenirs and distributed among the crowd. Her hair was supposedly torn out in chunks and sold as revolutionary memorabilia. The most disturbing reports, though their accuracy is debated by historians, claim that her heart was cut out and eaten by some of the killers. Revolutionary newspapers of the time described scenes of cannibalism, though these may have been exaggerated for propaganda purposes. What we know for certain is that Princess de Lamballe's corpse was never given a proper burial. Her remains simply disappeared into the chaos of revolutionary Paris, scattered and lost forever among the thousands of other victims of the September massacres. For over 2 centuries, historians have argued about which details of Princess de Lamballe's death are true and which are revolutionary propaganda or royalist mythology. But the core facts remain undisputed. She was brutally murdered by a mob, decapitated, and her severed head was used as a weapon of psychological torture against Marie Antoinette. The story of Princess de Lamballe has become a symbol of loyalty pushed to its ultimate extreme, a woman who chose death over betrayal, who walked knowingly into hell rather than abandon her friend. But it's also a terrifying reminder of what human beings are capable of when political rage overrides basic humanity. Her murder wasn't just an execution. It was a ritualistic sacrifice that revealed the true face of revolutionary violence. It showed how quickly ordinary people can become monsters when they're given permission to hate without limits. Today, Princess Marie-Thérèse Louise de Savoy Carignan lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in Paris. Her body lost to history, but her story preserved as one of the most shocking examples of loyalty and savagery ever recorded. She died as she lived, faithful to her friend until the very end, no matter the cost. The blood has long since washed from the cobblestones of La Force prison, but the echo of her story still resonates across the centuries. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about human nature, about the price of loyalty, and about how thin the line really is between civilization and savagery. Princess de Lamballe's final words, "It is not in my heart," became her epitaph. She couldn't find hatred in her heart, even when it would have saved her life. In a world consumed by rage and violence, she chose love and paid for it with the most brutal death imaginable. Her story stands as both an inspiration and a warning, proof that extraordinary loyalty exists, but also proof of the terrible price it sometimes demands. In the blood-soaked courtyard of La Force prison on September 3, 1792, Princess de Lamballe became something more than a victim. She became a symbol of what humans are capable of, both the absolute best and the absolute worst of our nature. The mob that killed her thought they were destroying a symbol of aristocratic corruption. Instead, they created a martyr whose story of loyalty and sacrifice would outlast their revolution and echo through history long after their names were forgotten. What do you think drove Princess de Lamballe to choose death over betrayal? Could you make the same choice she did? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more dark stories from history that reveal the shocking truth about human nature.